Bibles, open them to the 7th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 7. We're picking up on this story written by Luke, true story, of the happenings of Stephen. Stephen, as I said last Sunday night, wore 4 hats. He wore the hat of a deacon as he was chosen by the church to be one of the 7 to deacon the tables or serve the tables. And he wore the hat of a preacher as he preached the gospel, and that's what we see him doing here. He also wore the hat of a miracle worker. As I said, God gave him the ability to do miraculous things, and he was the closest person to being like the apostles without being one. And then, of course, he wore the hat of a martyr, which he ultimately dies, and we'll see that next Sunday night. But continuing on in this sermon that Stephen was preaching, he is basically telling the people of Israel, the religious leaders in particular who were listening to him, the whole story of the history of the nation of Israel. Basically is what he is doing here. And we left off at verse 19 last week, where it said that Israel, while in their captivity of slavery in Egypt, that the Pharaoh, who no longer knew who Joseph was because he's a new Pharaoh, he was terrified and nervous by the rapid growth of the population of the people of Israel. And he wanted to slow that down. And he thought the way to slow it down was to have every Hebrew baby boy to be thrown into a river and be killed. Well, this is the time Moses was born. So would you look at verse 20? In verse 20 it says, in which time Moses was born and was exceeding fair. He was a beautiful little baby that was born unto his parents. Amram and Jochebed were his parents. And his mother saw that he was a beautiful child, and she did not want him to be brutally slaughtered as the Pharaoh was doing. But also I do believe that Jochebed, the mother of Moses, somehow, some way sensed that Moses was a very special, unique child, and that God had his hand on him, and that God had a higher purpose for him. And I don't know, but I can't help but think that Moses' mother, Jochebed, perhaps discerned that about him. And so they made a little small ark or boat and put it into the Nile River and let it float. And so happened that Pharaoh's daughter came and saw the basket, and she rescues the baby, and she immediately fell in love with the child. And looking around, sees no mother anywhere around. The only one that was around was Miriam, the older sister of Moses. She was around because she, along with the mother, had the plan that hopefully Pharaoh's daughter, who would always go down to the river with her maidens to bathe in the river at a certain time every day, that maybe she would fall in love with the child, which she did, and that they would say, well, Miriam would go and say, I know a Hebrew woman that can nurse this baby. So they had it all planned, but God was in it, and God led them to this plan. But it says in verse 20 of Acts chapter 7, in the time Moses was born, he was exceeding fair and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. Now, 3 months. Exodus chapter 2, verse 2 says he was hid 3 months. Now, I don't know about you. I've been around babies. We had 3 of them, and we've got 2 grandbabies now. So I've been around babies. Most all of us in here have. Do you know how hard it would be to hide a baby for 3 months? When that baby gets hungry, that baby's going to squeal. When that baby gets fussy and sleepy, that baby's going to cry. and how hard it had to have been to hide this little baby for 3 months. But God preserved him because God had his eyes on him. God had his hand on him. God had a purpose for this child. He was spared. Other Hebrew babies were being killed, slaughtered by the Pharaoh, baby boys, but not Moses. God had his plan for him. It says in verse 21, when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. Now, you say, well, I thought his mother Jochebed and Miriam had this thing planned out where Jochebed would nurse him. Indeed, she did. Luke is not making a mistake here when it says she nourished him. It means she provided for him by letting Moses' mother nurse him until he got to be of age where he didn't have to be nursed by his mother. And so when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him and nourished him as if he was her own son. Moses, by being raised in Pharaoh's castle, I guess I'd say it, being raised in Pharaoh's home, had the privilege of being well educated. Moses did. He had the education. I'm sure Moses learned to speak Egyptian. I know he did. Speak it fluently. He also learned Hebrew. Moses was a very highly intelligent man, as he had access to the best schools, being raised in Egypt in Pharaoh's home. It says in verse 22, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. Mighty in words, that might seem a little bit confusing when later on we find, or not later on, but earlier on in history, in our studies in Exodus chapter 4, in 10 through 12 in particular, it says Moses claimed he had a speech impediment and that he could not speak, and he begged and pleaded with God to let his brother Aaron be the spokesperson when he led the Israelites out of their bondage. So mighty in words just simply means that Moses was very well educated, he was smart, and he knew how to put words together on paper, but he perhaps was not a very eloquent speaker as far as getting the words out of his mouth. But it says in verse 23, when Moses was a full 40 years old, it came to his heart to visit the brethren, the children, his brethren, the children of Israel. Now, Moses had the opportunity to live out the rest of his life as, I guess you'd call it, the stepson, or the adopted son, rather, of Pharaoh's daughter. He had that opportunity. But Moses, when he was a baby, I just believe that when he was a baby, that his mother, Jochebed, grounded him with the knowledge of the people of Israel and who they were, that they were God's chosen people, and how they had descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Moses learned about his people, his family, his blood relatives, the nation of Israel. I do believe that Jochebed was probably very instrumental in that. Certainly he would not have learned anything about Israel in the schools of Egypt, other than that they were slaves. So Moses had the opportunity to stay in the home of Pharaoh, but Moses would later make the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And this is what it says in Hebrews 11, 24 and 25 about Moses. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So when he was a 40-year-old man, he did not want to be called Pharaoh's daughter anymore. It says in verse 25, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Moses could have enjoyed the pleasures of sin, the writer of Hebrews calls it. That is, he could have had all the luxuries and the delicacies and the wealth and everything accessible to him in his life in Egypt. but he rejected that to go and identify himself with his people. What does that remind you of? Moses is a picture of Christ. Christ Jesus had the opportunity to remain on the throne with his Father in heaven. But instead, he chose rather to suffer the affliction with his people. He decided to come down to this earth where we are. We're not in bondage to the Egyptians, but we were in bondage to sin, slaves to sin. And our Moses, which is Jesus, came to where we are to save us and deliver us. Moses would be the deliverer of the people of Israel from their bondage. And we'll see that in just a moment. But then we go back and we look at Acts chapter 7. We find it says, when he was full 40 years, in verse 23, he decided to visit the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him. Oh, suffer wrong. Well, let me tell you. The Israelites were treated brutally. They were slaves. They had taskmasters who would beat them, make them work hard labor. They would whip them with whips. They treated them scornfully and hatefully. And so Moses went out to view what was happening among his brothers and sisters in the nation of Israel. And he saw how they were being brutally treated by the Egyptian taskmasters. He saw on one particular day a situation where an Egyptian taskmaster was brutally beating an Israelite, a Hebrew. That riled up the feathers of Moses. Didn't sit well with him because blood does run thicker than water. And Moses, knowing this was his Hebrew brother, decided he wanted to do something about it. He wanted to intervene. He wanted to stop this Egyptian from doing what he did. And Moses got a little aggressive as he fought the Egyptian. And not only did he stop the Egyptian from beating on the Hebrew, but it tells us in verse 24, seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and he smote the Egyptian. Smote means he beat him or killed him. Now this is what it says in Exodus chapter 2, verse 12. Everyone listen to this. Moses, when he beat up the Egyptian taskmaster, he looked this way and he looked that way. He looked every which way. And when he saw that there was no man who slew him, he did not see anyone nearby. And so Moses thought, well, I've gotten away with this. No one sees, no one knows. So when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He buried him in the ground. Moses killed the Egyptian taskmaster and buried him. He thought, I've gotten away with this. No one knows. Now Moses, I guess from his raising and hearing from his mama, heard about the Hebrew people and knew about their bondage, being that he was raised in Pharaoh's home. He knew all about it. So Moses wanted to be the deliverer for the people. And indeed, that was God's calling on Moses, to be the deliverer of the nation of Israel. Problem was, Moses, he jumped the gun on it. Moses started too early, prematurely. We can't get ahead of God. God will call us when he is ready for us to do anything. So Moses decided he's going to deliver, he's going to be a hero, and he's going to mightily deliver his people from their bondage of slavery. So look at it, verse 25, he supposed his brethren would have understood. The word supposed is a word which means assumed. So Moses assumed then that his brethren, the Israelites, would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. They understood not because it was not in God's timing yet. The next day, it says in verse 26, Moses showed himself unto them as a couple of them. It says they, but it's really two of the Hebrew slaves started to bicker among each other. Even though they were brothers in the Hebrew family, two of them started to scuffle and fight each other. They turned on one another. And Moses saw it. He said that, verse 26, the next day he showed himself and saw two of them as they strove. That means as they struggled or as they fought each other. Now it says he would have set them at one again. He would have calmed them down and brought peace to the situation, saying, sirs, you're brethren, you're brothers. You both have the same blood. You're Hebrews. You're descendants, both of you, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here you are fighting each other, Moses is telling them. Why do you do wrong one to another? Why do you fight each other? In verse 27, but he that did his neighbor wrong, one of the two men that were fighting, looked over at Moses and said, why, who are you who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou did the Egyptian yesterday? Moses probably thinking, uh-oh. I had looked around and I didn't see anyone watching. So I killed this man, the Egyptian taskmaster, buried him in the ground. I thought I got away with it. First of all, God knew it, if no one else did. There's nothing we can do that is a sin that God doesn't know. But there was a person who knew. So one of these guys that were fighting among the Hebrews apparently had seen or had heard, or word got out, and word like that travels fast. And word got out that Moses had killed an Egyptian. Worst thing that could have happened to Moses here is if Pharaoh found out. Guess what? Pharaoh did find out. For it says to us in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. Moses had been caught. It was now known to the Pharaoh of Egypt that Moses had killed an Egyptian. It didn't matter that Pharaoh and his daughter raised Moses and educated him. It didn't matter to Pharaoh at that time. Again, like I said, blood runs thicker than water. And so when a Hebrew among Hebrews killed an Egyptian among Egyptians, Pharaoh didn't sit too well with that. So he is searching out now for Moses to try to kill Moses. So Moses fled. It says that Moses was 40 years old, and he fled to a place called Midian. Would you look at verse 29? He fled to a place called Midian, and he was a stranger in Midian, where he begat two sons. Now, what happened here? Moses got married. He met up with a man by the name of Reuel, also known as Jethro. And no, it's not Jethro Bodine. That's a different one. But he met up with a man named Jethro who had a daughter. Her name was Zipporah. And he started to work as a shepherd for Jethro or Reuel. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 21 and 22, it says Moses was content to dwell with the man. And so the man gave Moses Zipporah for his daughter, and she bare him a son and called his name Gershom. Gershom means stranger. His firstborn Gershom meant stranger because Moses knew in Midian, in this desert, I'm in a strange land. I want to deliver my people out of their bondage of slavery in Egypt, and I've had to run from the Pharaoh because he wants me dead. So I'm stuck out here in this desert. But one good thing, one positive, he did get him a wife and has a child. It says in Exodus chapter 18, verse 4, he had another son, and the name of the other was Eliezer, which means help of my God. Now let's go to verse 30. When 40 more years passed, Moses' life is broken up into three series of 40 years. First 40 years of his life, he lived in the Egyptian palace and then killed the Egyptian taskmaster, buried him in the ground, got caught, and took off, went to Midian. The next 40 years of his life, till he's 80, he worked in the desert with his wife and sons and was a shepherd. When he's 80 years old, once upon a time, on a certain given day, Moses was out in the hot desert, and he saw something that looked quite strange to him. Got a little closer, and it was a bush that was on fire. The bush not only was burning, it was not consuming. And then a theophany came out of that bush. A theophany is God making himself manifest through something, through an object, like a burning bush. And God began to speak to him from that flame of fire. Don't you know, it had to have stunned Moses when he saw and heard that. So when he was a full 40 years later, when he's 80 years old, we're expired, verse 30, there appeared unto him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus in pre-incarnate form in a theophany by way of the burning bush. It was Jesus. Spoke through that burning bush to Moses, and the flame of fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, it says in verse 31, he wondered at the sight. As he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled. I guess so. I would imagine certainly he would tremble and durst not behold. He was just mystified at what he's seen. Then verse 33 says, Then said the Lord unto him, Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest, it is holy ground. God said, Take off your sandals, Moses. You're standing on holy ground as you are in the presence of God. So Moses did. He said, I have seen, and he repeated it. I have seen the affliction, or God said, I have seen, in repetitive form here, he said again, I have seen the affliction of my people which is in Egypt. I've heard their groaning, and I am come down to deliver them. Now, again, Moses wanted to be that deliverer. God chose him to be that deliverer. That's why God spared his life at his birth. The Egyptian princes rescued him. Miriam said, I know a woman that can nurse him. Moses' mother. They didn't know that. God was in this all the way. And so he's to be the one to deliver them. But it wasn't time yet. When it was time, God said, Moses, pay attention to this bush. I'm in this bush. The fire of God. Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people. In Exodus 3, 7 and 8, God said, I have seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt. I've heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and unto a land flowing with milk and honey. That's what God said to Moses from the burning bush. Now, then it says in the latter part of verse 34, God said to Moses, I've told you I've seen the affliction of my people, and so now come, I will send thee into Egypt. Now this Moses, whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hands of the angel which appeared to them in the bush. So in other words, Moses fled Egypt as a 40-year-old man, knowing he killed a man, and Pharaoh was trailing him. Pharaoh was after him. And so now the angel, which is God, says, go back. Go back to that place where you had to run for your life. God was going to be with them. And verse 36 says, Moses brought them out. There's a ton of history we've omitted here, haven't we? I mean, Stephen was preaching. And he did preach a long, lengthy sermon here, but he did leave a lot of history out. The 10 plagues. He delivered them, he brought them out. After that, he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt. The 10 plagues, which was he turned water into blood, frogs, lice, flies, the livestock pestilence, the boils, the hail, the locust, the darkness, and the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians. Those are the 10 plagues. And in the wilderness, well, in the land of Egypt, he did the plagues, but also we see that God, through Moses, did a miracle at the Red Sea. As he led them after the 10 plagues unto the Red Sea, there the trampling sound of the horses and the squealing sound of the wheels and the chariots following them. And Moses is at the ocean, and he sees the Egyptians coming, 2 to 3 million Israelites. And Moses is at a breaking point here. God, what in the world am I going to do? And Moses hears from God. God says, look at the ocean. Moses looks at the ocean. God says, go forward. Moses looks at God and says, what? Before you take a step, though, Moses, take your rod and hold it up. And he does, in obedience to God. And Moses was not a magician. He did not miraculously part the sea. God parted the sea. Only thing Moses did was obey God. Moses held up the rod, God parted the sea, and they crossed over the other side. What a miracle. And then in the wilderness for 40 years, more miracles. The Israelites got thirsty. They were in a desert for 40 years. God gave them water from a rock. They were hungry. God gave them manna from heaven in that 40-year period. Then, verse 37, Stephen said in his sermon, this is that same Moses which said to the people of Israel, at a certain time that a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you, your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear. When did Moses ever say something like that? In Deuteronomy chapter 18. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses did once upon a time say, the Lord thy God said it to Israel, will raise you up a prophet unto thee from the midst of thee of thy brethren, like unto me, said Moses, unto him shall you hearken. What prophet is he talking about? None other than Jesus, the Son of God. Moses said, I delivered the people of Israel. This Jesus will deliver whosoever will call upon him. Stephen preached, this Moses delivered the people of Israel. But this prophet that Moses talked about is our deliverer. And that's what Stephen, the point he's getting to. Then verse 38, he said, this is he that was in the church. In the church? Old Testament? Is that out of place? No. The word church comes from a Greek word, ecclesiastes, or ecclesia rather, I'm sorry. That's the book, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesia, which means assembly. So was he in the assembly? This is the same Moses that was in the assembly in the wilderness. The wilderness is the desert. So among the 2 to 3 million Israelites, when their 40 years of wilderness wanderings, Moses was in assembly with them, with the same angel that has spoken to him on Mount Sinai from the bush, and with our fathers. This is Stephen preaching, talking about their ancestors who were in that wilderness. And they received the lively oracles. What do you think the lively oracles are? Come on, someone out there, just guess. 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust them from them, and their hearts turned back again into Egypt. You know, those Israelites, they were a stubborn, stiff-necked, hard-headed people. And they were people that griped all the time. They complained. They were very negative. They were in that wilderness, in that desert, and they said, Moses, we wish we could go back to Egypt, to the flesh pots. At least there we might have suffered, but at least we ate good. And it beats these little tiny pieces of bread that falls from the sky. At least we ate fish there. And we were very well taken care of as far as eating. And they bickered and they complained all the time. They complained when they were thirsty. And so Moses had to deal with that. He just delivered them out of their bondage of slavery, and it was very, very small, petty things that they complained about. Verse 40 says, saying unto Aaron, they said one time when Moses was up on the mountain receiving the law, he was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And when he was up there 40 days, 40 nights, verse 40 says, the people of Israel they're in that desert. They went to Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the priest, said, make us gods, go before us. For as this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. We wot not what has become of him. And what had come of him is he's on the mountain with God for 40 days and 40 nights. They didn't know. So Moses foolishly, ignorantly made a golden calf. And the people foolishly and ignorantly worshiped that golden calf. God was very angry. God's righteous indignation showed big time when he looked down and saw what his people were doing. God was ready to literally obliterate the nation. But Moses pleaded for God's mercy. When God looks down at our world today, I often think, would God look at us and think, I should just obliterate this world? But his son's death on the cross pleads for our grace and mercy. It is only by the grace and mercy that God does not destroy us. So, and then we go to verse 42. When the people of Israel, when they worshiped these idols, God turned them and gave them up. Turned them and gave them up means he turned them over to a reprobate mind, to worship the host of heaven, the stars of the heavens. As it is written in the book of the prophets, Isaiah chapter 5, verse 25 says, O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space 40 years in the wilderness? You read Amos 5:25 and you'll see that is a quote of that. What happened later on in Israel's history? Well, after Joshua led them into the promised land and they built the temple, later on they just slowly but surely, gradually rebelled, backslid into idolatry, and ultimately were taken captive by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And Stephen is hammering down this point to the Israelite leaders when he's preaching this sermon, saying, you yourselves are worshiping religion and rejecting the Savior. So what about us? Whom is the source of our worship? Things of this world or God? It's all about him, not us. And may we never, ever forget that. Let us pray.